Hey guys, it's Robin, RsIslandCrafts, and welcome to my craft room. You guys ready to start working on some string blocks? I loved all the excitement and enthusiasm from last week's video. I'm going to go ahead and link it up there in the iCard for anyone who's missed it. And for those that you've already watched it, you might want to go back and check out the comments. So there's a lot of tips and tricks in there that I thought were really interesting, and there's a lot of knowledge base in those comments. So as we're going through this series, as you're watching the video, it might be good to come back and just check out the comments and see what everyone else is doing, because we've learned a few things. We learned that telephone books are similar to newspapers on how they look, but they're definitely 100% different. The ink does not rub off of these. Many people have used the phone books with no problems. Someone even mentioned that Bonnie Hunter has told us that we should let our phone books cure for 3 years, and that everything will be all set and it'll be fine and you won't have to worry about it. And for those of you that are thinking about using newspapers, there was another good comment that said that if you go ahead and dry iron with no steam or anything, that it'll set the ink of the newspaper and you won't have to worry about it coming off on your hands. A lot of good tips over there. So for those of you just joining us, these are string blocks. We're just going to be taking strips of fabric, whether they're scraps or fabric that we've purchased. I like to sew mine down onto paper. Some people like to sew theirs down onto fabric. And as in the previous video, there's a whole bunch of different things that you can go ahead and use in place of, or whatever you need for your foundation if you don't want to just do it with, I'm using notebook paper with the school lines on it, the little college ruled with those blue lines. I like to use the school paper to make mine just because I have a whole bunch of it and I bought it very inexpensively and it's easy to tear off. But all that information will be in last week's video that you'll see up there in the iCard. So this week we're going to go ahead and start cutting our foundations, and then we will discuss center strips, different widths, what we need for fabric again, and we will start sewing some of our strips down. Let me move these out of the way and bring in some foundations. If you've seen one of my older videos, I showed how to take, you might want to go back and check out this video because this mat was covered in batting and felt. It was like all white and furry, but I went ahead and I found a couple techniques, and I have a little bit, I don't want to ruin the secret and the surprise, just check out the video and see how well it cleaned up. This is one of my original mats that I did not want to just throw away. There's only lines on one side, but of course it's a mat. You can use it on both sides. But I save it for things like this. Whenever I'm going to be cutting paper, or I want to cut batting or felt or anything, I don't want to get anything stuck into my good mat, and I know you can easily clean it out because I showed that in this video. But why bother? I'd rather just leave this one as clean as possible and just use it for cutting quilting squares and trimming up and stuff like that. And for all the down and dirty stuff, I use this mat. So I'm just going to start off with my school paper here. And another thing I like to use is I keep separate rotary cutters. When they went on sale, I went and bought another one. I originally got one I bought a set. It had the rotary cutter, it had this mat, and it had this not very nice plastic ruler that I just no longer use. But anyways, I have two of them. I have the 45 millimeter, but I mark mine. This is one for cutting fabric, and this is the one for cutting paper. As this blade gets dull and it's no longer safe for me to cut fabric with it, I transfer it over to my paper cutter. Now, of course, I don't have to change this one as often because I don't cut paper as often as I do fabric. So the little containers that the blades come in, those little plastic with the flat and the round, little flippy open thing, I write paper on one, or I write old or dull or whatever you want. So when I take it out of there, I put it in that container, put a new one in, and I'm good to go. When this one starts to feel dull to me and not safe to use, I'll go ahead and dispose of this one. I usually put it in some type of a container because I don't like to put it straight in the trash. It is kind of sharp, and I wouldn't want anyone to be pushing down in the trash or doing anything strange and get cut by it. Plus, you never know what's going to happen when they take it to the dump or to the incinerators and all that stuff. I wouldn't want anyone to accidentally get hurt. So I do keep this like broken glass. I put it into a safe container. But then I can just change that out as needed. I like to do, my blocks are 6.5 inches. I like to stick with that size. Now, I want to trim these down, so I don't want to start at 6.5 inches. I want to have extra fabric going past my paper and stuff like that. So I like to start with my squares a 1/2 inch larger. So I'm going to start with 7-inch squares. The papers, if you check to line everything up on your lines to see if it's square. If it's square enough, then you can just go ahead and cut in the corner. Now remember, we're going to trim these down to 6.5 inches, so if it's off a little bit and it's not perfect, it's not going to matter. I do a few sheets at a time, 4 or 5, not too many. Now I will save this also because I can either make rectangle strings with it or I can cut it in half, and I would have about 3.5 inches, so I can make 3-inch blocks out of that, and it makes a really nice border when you're doing a mini quilt, a little wall hanging or something. And trust me, when you make little itty bitty 3-inch string blocks, people who aren't part of the quilting world will go, ooh, that's fancy. So it's kind of a nice little trick. It's really simple to sew the strings on a small block just as it is on a larger block, but people do get a little excited. So once again, I'm going to line up at 7 inches. Now this part I can just go ahead and throw it away, put it in the recycle bin. I can save it to make handmade paper with, whatever you choose. You can also save all these together and put them on a clipboard and just use them for scratch paper. It's really good for that too, like if you're trying to figure out the math for a quilt or design a block or something. So that's what I'm going to be using. Now let's look at the other options. You can have your telephone book. I believe I'd already cut these. Yep, I just went ahead and I ripped the pages out and I just trimmed them down to 7 inches, just like you saw me do this. I've also gone ahead and grabbed some wrapping paper that still seems to have the tape on it, so I'll remove that. As I'm stitching my blocks, I wanted to just go ahead and use any of the items that you might be using so you can see how it looks and how easy it peels off. So I have my school paper, I have Christmas wrapping paper, I have a phone book, and I've also gone ahead and I don't know if you can see, but this is pretty thin fabric. See how you can see easily through it to the lines on the ruler? Plus, this is a fabric that I'm really not in love with and I'm probably not going to use for anything, so it would make a good foundation fabric to use when I'm making my string blocks. And one more thing that we didn't discuss last week is you can also do these quilt as you go. So you can take yourself and make some batting blocks. I would still do a 1/2 inch larger so that we can trim them down. So if you have any scrap batting laying around, you can go ahead and trim that up. Because a lot of times when you're doing quilts and you're trimming off the edge after you're squaring it up, there tends to be extra binding after the quilting process because a lot of times we like to leave an extra few inches on the side. If you're using the batting to do the quilt as you go, you're going to go ahead and save yourself that one step and you're not going to have to worry about quilting it. So if this is one of your first quilts and you don't want to have to think about how you're going to quilt something, especially if you're making a bed-size quilt, you can easily do a twin or a double. We did the herringbone quilt as you go quilt up there. I'll go ahead and put that up in the iCard also, so you can see how that process goes. And as you can see, what's nice about one of these small mats is you can just keep spinning it and spinning it, and it's easy to move it around. As you saw, I still used my paper cutter for the batting because that way I don't have to worry about dulling my good blade. And see how it sticks and leaves the fiber in my mat. Now I'm not going to worry about cleaning this up. I could go ahead and clean it up right away, but since this is my scrappy mat that I'm using for any of these items, I'm just going to go ahead and leave it like this and set it aside, and I'll worry about it when it gets to the point that it gets harder to cut the fabrics and stuff or the batting because I have so much fuzz in it. Now we talked last week about using scraps and getting them prepared for this week. I went ahead and I pulled out my bins. I have my 1.5 strips, my 2.5 strips, and my 2-inch strips. So I'm just going to go ahead and as I'm building the blocks, I'm going to set this over by my sewing machine so I can just reach in here and grab out anything that looks good, that is long enough, because sometimes, you know, things like this is just not going to work for us with our string blocks. Now you could also decide to use the same width for everything. I thought these were pretty similar, and using the 1.5 to 2 and the 2.5, the 1.5 is going to give me a little bit of a narrower strip, and I like the way that kind of plays with the wider strips. You can use something larger than 2.5 if you want, but that's best if you're doing maybe a 12.5 inch block or even a 15.5 inch block. When I'm doing a 6.5, I like to use just smaller increments, because if I put my center strip down and say I use a 2.5 inch strip, and then I go ahead and I put a 3.5 or a 4 inch strip next to it, I'm not going to have as many colors, as I'm not going to be able to have as many fabrics as changes over through here. So with my center strip, and then I've got a big chunk of a wide one here, I'm only going to be able to have the center strip and 2 different colors. Now if that's the look you're going for, then that's perfect. Go ahead and use wider strips. But I like how the thin ones will go ahead and just kind of, it changes it up a little bit so it's not as uniform for me. But at the same time, it looks really nice. I really love this fabric. I don't think I have any more of this, and I would like to get some more because look how cute it is. Plus, if you know me, you know I like any kind of bright colors on the black background, so that's really nice. So I'm going to go ahead and get myself set up over by the sewing machine. You guys can come meet me over there and we'll sew a couple blocks. So before we get started, I have this blue tape to cover up this little bump here, because as you're stitching, it kind of gets, I'm not doing anything with seams, but I still like to cover it because things tend to get hooked on there. So that's just what that blue painter's tape is for. It doesn't leave any sticky residue or anything like that. I have just some neutral thread that I'm just trying to use up in my sewing machine right now. And as I mentioned in the first video, it's a good place to use up bobbins of random thread and old bits of random thread that you're no longer going to use. I've gone ahead and I took my stitch length and I've just decreased it just a couple little spins and notches so it's not as long, and it's going to help perforate the paper and make it easier to remove. I like to keep it just a pair of scissors over here on the side, so as I'm going I can go ahead. I started with my center strips and they're really long, so I can go ahead and trim some of my strips of fabric as I'm going. So I have my fabric scissors. I went ahead and grabbed one of everything we're going to be testing out today. I have my batting, I have telephone, school paper, shopping paper, and fabric. And that way, as I'm going through the process, you can see how it's going to look and if I have to handle anything differently based on the foundation that I've chosen. I have a little pile of my strips and strings over to the side that I can just grab. Let's just go ahead and start with what I like to use, the school paper. Now, if you want everything to line up exactly and you want that center strip that I showed last week that's going to make all the special designs, you want to make sure all of your center strips are the same color or the same fabric and the same width. Now, you can go ahead and line it up perfectly so it's half and half. You can use a glue stick or a pin, or you can just be wild and crazy and set it down. Since I'm using the different widths, it doesn't always bother me if these strips aren't going to line up. I do love it when everything lines up exactly and you're using all the same widths of fabric and everything like that. But when I'm using all different widths, I like it to just go ahead and be a little bit off, a little wonky, so it doesn't bother me. I can also, when I do the trimming, I can make sure I get everything lined up as best as I can so that this is centered. I have some extra fabric hanging off the edge. I can leave it, or I can go ahead and trim it. This fabric, even though it's black, you can't tell, but if I were using a regular fabric like this, I would want it to be right sides up. My fabric doesn't have a right or wrong side, so how I put it down, it doesn't really matter. You can fold your fabric in half to find the center, fold the paper in half, whatever it is that you need to do to make sure you have it the way you want. But I'm just going to eyeball it because, as I said, we're going to trim it up a little bit afterwards anyways. Then I'm going to go over to my pile of fabrics. I'm going to grab something that I know is going to be long enough to cover this section over here, like we did with the herringbone. We need to make sure that the fabric goes past the paper on both sides. But we're going to put it right sides together on top of our center strip. And then we're going to sew, you can sew a 1/4 inch. It doesn't have to be exact. If you have a little narrower fabric, you can have a little narrower seam allowance because we're going to be stitching it to the foundation paper. And this foundation paper is going to help us keep everything lined up so that we're going to stay in a square and things aren't going to get stretched and biased and a bit wonky. If we had yards of fabric and we were just going to make squares like this, there's a technique where you can just sew long strips of all your colors together, and then you take your rulers and you cut them a certain way, and then you can get the diagonal like this. But since we're just using scraps, we're going to use this piece of paper, this foundation, to give us a guideline to know how long our strips need to be and to make sure we kind of stay in a square shape. Does that make sense? I just put it under. I have my machine right now. It is set at the 1/4 inch foot, so that means my needle has moved over to the right, and from the side of my foot it's a 1/4 inch. That's one of the nice things about this Juki, that I can just line it up. But if you just use the side of your presser foot, and then all your seams will be the same. And once again, I said it doesn't exactly have to be a 1/4 inch. It could be a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller. This is one of those things that as a new sewer, a new quilter, you can kind of play with it and not worry about everything being perfect. And it's also good for you quilters that have been around for a while and do like to have everything perfect. Sometimes it's a nice little exercise to just go a little crazy and let the chaos take over. I'm starting just past the paper here, and then I'm going to stitch and stitch off of the paper. I have a lot of extra fabric here. Well, not a lot. I have a decent amount, a few inches. I can go ahead and trim it if I want, but I want to make sure when I fold it back over onto the paper that it's going to actually cover and not be too short. So when it's something short like this, less than 6 inches or so, I tend to just leave it on there. If it had come and it was like a full 42-inch length, I would go ahead and give it a few inches out here and then just trim it. That way I know that I've got enough to cover when I fold it over. Now, one of the benefits of this machine is I've set my foot pedal up, so when I put my heel down on it, it automatically will cut the thread for me. If you have a knee lift, now's a good time to use that knee lift also, so you don't have to constantly be bringing your hands back and forth. You can just go ahead and let the other body parts take care of it. The foot pedal will cut it for me. My knee lift will bring my foot up. I do tend to do a lot of chain piecing with these, so I like to do more than one block, but I just wanted to show you what one block would look like. Now, if you'd like, you can go ahead and trim this. You see how if we trimmed it too short and pulled it over, it might not cover all this paper, but I left it nice and long, and if I want, I can go ahead and trim it here. And I could always use this in another block in a shorter section. Now here you have options again. You can just finger press this, and you'll be all set to add the next one on, or you can take it to the iron and press it with the iron. The only thing you got to think about here is if you're using a batting that's not 100% cotton, you can't use your iron on this because it'll melt right to your iron. So if you have a poly blend or a polyester, you're going to have to finger press it. I'm just going to show you one block, and then I'll show you what it looks like when we do more than one at a time. So then I just go back to my pile, and I have to think, because I'm working on a small block now. If I were to put this strip of fabric and kind of hang it over about a 1/4 inch, that's just going to leave me this little bit of square here. Let me put something underneath it so you can see. You see how I just have a small chunk of square here? Now remember, we're going to be trimming off a 1/2 inch here and a 1/2 inch there. So we're just going to end up with this little tiny piece of fabric in the corner there. So I might not want to use my larger strip here. I might want to save it to go on the other side so that it uses up some area. And I might decide with such a small block like this that maybe I don't want to do the 2.5 inch strips. Maybe they are a little bit large. So I can find my next strip. I can just grab out of the pile and just pop it on there, or I can kind of look at it and say, is this the color that I want? Make sure it's not too together. I try not to have two of the same fabrics in the same block, unless I'm into a situation where I'm at the bottom of the barrel and I just need to make one more block. Sometimes I'll do it, but let's face it, we usually have so many scraps that there's really no need to repeat fabrics in the same block. So once again, I'm always going right sides together. I have a little selvage there. I'm not going to worry about trimming it off. I'll just put it at the end of the block so that it will be trimmed off when I stitch. I kind of go past, I make sure it's just going to go past. When you fold it over, you know you're pretty good. Once you get going, just like with the herringbone, you'll be able to eyeball it and not have to worry about it. Pop it back under my machine, and I'm going to start stitching past my paper, and I'm going to stop past my paper. Again, give it a little finger press. Now, several of the people the blogs that like to do this a lot, they recommend that you save maybe some 5-inch squares from maybe your charm squares for here. Then you can take that 5-inch square, cut it on the diagonal, and you can use that triangle piece to cover up this corner. Now, I tend to just be working from scraps and 5-inch pieces of fabric I save for making actual regular quilt blocks, so I don't normally do that here. But I do look for some of my wider pieces. Now that we have this piece here, we can go ahead and put that on there. If we use about a 1/4 inch, we're going to have this little tiny bit that sticks out. But remember, we're going to go ahead and trim a 1/2 inch off of both sides, so that's fine. And if we're worried about that, we'll just use a scant 1/4 inch, and we won't sew right. That way we'll sew closer to the edge, and it'll make sure that we have enough fabric to cover up that corner. So instead of using the edge of my presser foot, maybe I'll use the inside here and just make it, like I said, a scant 1/4. When you're making smaller blocks like this, it doesn't normally take that much fabric to actually make the blocks. You'll find that it's a pretty quick process as you get going, but you see I've gone ahead and I've covered up that paper. I used that scant 1/4 inch and everything is nice there, and I've already finished 1/2 of my block. Now I can spin it around and start on this half, but I want to go ahead and work on these and show you how I chain piece them. And that way you don't have to stop at each block. If you're using your cutter, you are going to save on the thread, but if you have to bring it up and use it here or cut your thread with scissors, eventually you're going to be using up a lot of that extra thread. And even though we're considering it waste thread because it's not thread we would normally use for other projects, it's still thread that we've already paid for, and it's kind of good to save it. So if you don't have the automatic cutter, and anyways, I like to do the chain piecing because it seems like I can go through the blocks faster. Maybe if I only needed 1 or 2 for a small little project bag or a coin purse or something like that, I would just do a couple blocks. But if I'm working on just using it to sew up my scraps and to get them out of the scrap bin, or I'm going to actually make a quilt with it, I like to do chain piecing. So let's start with our fabric. Now you can have it right side up or you can have it wrong side up. It's all up to you. It's going to be inside your quilt so no one's going to see it. I'm used to always working off of the opposite side or something like that. You know how you always put right sides together, so I tend to build it on the back of my fabric. That way all my blocks will have the pretty side up. It doesn't matter, it's just one of those things. So I have long strips. I believe I probably cut this off of the length of something instead of the width, because that is definitely more than 42 inches as far as I can eyeball. I'll go ahead and lay it down. I do have a little bit of selvage on the end, so I'll make sure that is past the top of the block. And I'll go ahead and trim it. You can do all this ahead of time, figure out what length of fabric you need from here to there. This machine has this fancy little thing on here with a ruler, and it tells me for my 7-inch block that I'm going to trim down that I need about a 10-inch length of fabric, maybe 10.5 or 11 if you want to make sure you have enough to go over the edge in case anything moves. So you can go ahead and trim those up ahead of time, and that'll save you the extra time of cutting it. So maybe this time I want to go ahead and use this fabric in a section up here so I can use the whole width. I'm not sure if it's going to fit, so I'm going to audition it to make sure it will cover. Yes, it does cover everything. So I will lay it down. And this is no different than stitching through the paper or sewing fabric blocks together. You just have that fabric foundation. You can use a walking foot if you want, because your fabric will move just a little bit, or you can just use your regular, I just have my standard sewing machine foot in here that I like. It's clear in the front so that I can see where the fabric's going through and the needle and all that stuff. I sew past my fabric foundation. Sometimes I will just spin it out of the way, but if it's only a couple stitches, I might just stitch to the end of that fabric strip. Once again, I'm going to put the snowman on the outside just so I can see it, because it'll make me laugh. Take my center strip, trim it down. Sometimes when you're starting to iron and press this and stuff, the paper will curl up. You can always flip it over and press it the other way, or just kind of deal with it. Now I have black fabric here. This has enough color in it. I don't mind putting it right next to it, but let me see if I can find something else. I do have a narrower strip of this fabric, but I've already used it in 2 blocks, so I might just go ahead and set that aside and use these kitty cats. Once again, I need to make sure I put these right sides together. When you're working on the paper, the fabric tends to wiggle and move a lot, so if you want to pop a pin in it, or like I said, use a glue stick to hold it in place. I'm going to trim my extra off now, because I can see that I'm well past the corner here. I wiggled a little there, and it's still going to be okay. It's not going to hurt anything. My block just might have a little bit of a zigzag in it, but it's still going to work out fine. That wrapping paper was a little bit slippery today. So let's try the phone book. We haven't had a phone in a while, a standard phone, you know, a non-cell phone, but I did look up our last name just to see if it was in here or any family members. I thought it would have been kind of fun to use the phone book pages that has our phone numbers on it. So I have this cute little border part of a fabric, and that's nice. It's going to add some nice color against the black. Now I'm going to leave this one in here. I haven't cut the thread. I haven't taken it out or moved it. I'm just going to keep sewing off of this fabric right onto this next one. I can stop. I can make sure that I'm still at the center here and adjust as necessary. Now I have a bit of extra fabric here, so maybe I'll turn this block sideways and just sew off of it. And that way I'm not using that extra thread to sew through there, but normally depending on the length of the fabric, I don't worry about it. Now I have my batting strip. Now as you're sewing through all these papers and everything, your sewing machine needle will become dull. It's going to take a bit for it to dull to go all the way through, so I don't always put a brand new needle in. Sometimes I will save a needle and put it in a little piece of felt in my needle container, and I'll write that it's paper. So anytime I'm doing paper piecing, I'll use that same needle. That way I'll have a nice sharp one for sewing regular things, blocks, and project bags. But when I go to do crazy things like this and I'm sewing through paper, or I'm doing quilt as you go, I can go ahead and use that needle that's just a little bit dull, and then use it until it's no longer going through. It's same as any other needle. When it gets dull, it'll make the thump 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 noise. You'll find maybe that your stitches are kind of a little loose, or you're getting bobbin thread pop up. Then you'll know it's time to get a new needle. I have a little crazy fabric here I'm going to put down. As you know, I like using the novelty fabric and I love all the colors. My blocks tend to get colorful. If I don't want to start right at the edge here, I can just lift my needle up, slide that block out of the way, but see, then again, I'm using up thread anyways, so it would have been just as easy to keep sewing onto the fabric. Since you're using the batting, it tends to hold your fabric really well because the cotton sticks to the cotton. It might be a little different if you're using polyester, but then it just holds it nicely. Now normally I would chain piece. I like to do 10 blocks for some reason when I do my crumbs and when I do my strings. I'm just going to go ahead and separate each block. You can then take these blocks over to your iron and you can go ahead and press them open. So let's go ahead and do that. Now remember, as long as you're not using anything polyester and everything here is cotton, our batting is cotton, our fabric is cotton, and the fabric that I'm stitching on top is cotton. So I can go ahead and use my iron on it. Now definitely 100% if you're using, you know, you have to have a cotton batting. So I can go ahead and I'm going to go like this. I have no problem putting it on it. If you're using some type of polyester fabric, then you should already know how to set your iron to a temperature that's not going to damage your fabric. And then I still say anytime you're using a batting that it needs to be 100% cotton, or you have to finger press it. So if you're using your polyester and poly blends, it's perfectly fine to still use it. You're just going to go ahead and take your fabric and finger press it. But since I've gone ahead and sewed these blocks on different things and I know everything's cotton, I can just go ahead and push it over. Make sure I don't have any of the little tucks over here, and I just press it down. And it's going to be the same thing with any of our other foundations. I just go ahead and I like to still set the seam just like we do when we're sewing blocks. I just kind of push it over. Now you're still going to check for biases and stuff, and you're not going to go and scrub it and everything like that. You still want to be reasonably kind to your fabric and just kind of push it over, give it a little bit of a press. As you get going, you're not going to really be spending a lot of time on this. This is just a quick, simple step. And as you can see, a lot of times after you steam your paper, it starts to curl up like that. And if it's a problem and it gives you grief and you can't stitch on it because it's curly everywhere, just go ahead. A lot of times after it starts to cool down, those curls will go away. Now I've noticed with the wrapping paper that it is definitely better to go ahead and leave your colored dyed side down. I just realized as I was going to iron that side, if you might have seen it, that my iron got stuck to it. So we've now learned that lesson, and it didn't do any damage to my iron. My iron is still nice and relatively clean for what I keep my iron. I do have to clean out a couple calcium deposits. It's about due for that because I do put water in it. And we have well water, so there's that. But if you just go ahead and sew onto the back, it's not a problem. Let's see what it looks like when we do our telephone book. Now, if you can't find telephone books and this is something that you really want to use, you can also find some of those, there's catalogs. Like I get a connecting threads one. Now, it's not very thick, it's a thin one. But I also, sometimes I get catalogs from different manufacturers that want to sell me mop buckets. Because I used to be in housekeeping, so somehow I got on a list somewhere. But you can also pick those up. There's sometimes you'll see them in some free places where you get, oh, like Toys R Us is not around anymore, but Toys R Us used to have that Christmas catalog that was nice and thick. So there are other places that you can find it. But you don't have to use a telephone book. You can use any type of paper that you can come across. Those big rolls that they have to put on the doctor's table when you go ahead and see him as a patient, sometimes you can pick that up at the doctor's office. They have the end of the rolls, or you can purchase it online. Those big rolls of paper that come for the kids that they draw on, just check it out to make sure it's not too thick. I received a message recently that this person has all that brown paper when you order from like Walmart or something online. They pack it with a lot of brown paper. I believe I put it on Instagram before. I just fold it up and press it and make it nice and flat, and I use it to doodle on and for other things. She's going to try it for this. I'm not sure if it's going to be too thick. It's thinner than a paper bag, but we'll see how she does with that. But in my area, there's a lot of places where you can just get free newspapers. They might not be your main one, but they might just be different types that are advertising, and you can just pick them up in one of those. You know, they're free. Just pull down the little the newspaper box and get them out of there. So you can get a few of those there too. So you don't necessarily have to purchase any paper. So you'll be able to find it somewhere. So now all of my blocks are ready. I can go ahead and start adding some more strips and just run them through once again, one right after another, and not have to worry about stopping each one and pressing them. I like to do them in a big bunch like this, and I will fill this up, and then when I'm done, I just have to do the other side. I'm going to go ahead and stitch up a couple blocks so that you can see what they look like when they're done, and then next week we'll go ahead and talk about trimming them up and getting everything ready. And once you get all your fabric stitched down to your blocks, it's going to look something like this. And as you can see, we looking from the back, you see that we've covered up all of our paper all the way around, even on this one where we got it right close to the edge, but we did get it. It is covered. Once again, we are going to be putting our 6.5 inch ruler down onto this and trimming it up, so we will be losing a 1/2 inch, quarter of an inch. I can do math. This is a 7-inch square. We're going to be making it into a 6.5 inch quilt block, so we're going to lose a 1/4 inch on each of the sides. So just ignore what I said over there at the sewing machine. I did catch on. What I like to do is I don't worry about any of those math things. These are one of those projects that are supposed to be nice and relaxing. I just make sure that everything covers all of my corners and that I have it all along my edges and I have extra fabric sticking out. Now, a lot of times I look at these blocks and I'm like, ooh, I don't really like the way it looks. It kind of looks kind of scraggly and ugly. But once we trim it up, you'll see that these look really nice. For those of you that are sewing along with us, go ahead and see if you can get as many of these blocks done as you can. Do it at your leisure. Don't worry about having that pressure. If you just have one block done for next week, then you'll be able to go ahead and do the next step and you'll be able to practice trimming it up. For those of you that have been doing these strings for a while, you already know what's going to be happening. We're going to take this scraggly, ugly block and we're going to turn it into something pretty. Just remember, as you're working on these, this is supposed to be fun and relaxing. Don't stress over it. For those of you that have some issues and don't like to leave things up to chance, maybe go ahead and set your colors up ahead of time. You can make little piles of your fabrics, like maybe you want all blues here and all reds, and that way as you're stitching you can get it all prepared ahead of time. And for those of us that don't mind a little chaos, just throw a stack of scraps up on top of your sewing table and just grab one as you go and stitch them on. So if you have any questions or if you have any tips and tricks, just go ahead and leave them down in the comments. If you've enjoyed this video, please go ahead and hit that like button. And if you'd like to see more Scrappy videos and you want to follow along with this series, think about go ahead and hitting that subscribe button. And if you ring that little bell, YouTube will let you know whenever I put out a video. I do have videos out on Tuesday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Tuesdays is my Talk to Me Tuesday, Wednesdays is Sew With Me, and on Friday we work on a project like this, some type of a Sew With Me project. And if you have any friends that have a big pile of scraps like you and I do, go ahead and use that little share button down below and share this video with them, and they can go ahead and stitch along with us throughout this series. And for my patrons, thank you so much for supporting me and my channel. And for those of you that are over on Patreon and you're at the $15 a month level or higher, you will be receiving the extended version of this video. Now, depending on when I get the 2 videos out, you might just see the extra bit that I'm going to add on to the end. Instead, that way you won't have to watch the whole entire video again. Everything you've seen today will be the same, but then I'll just show you that extended version, as we've discussed before, where I do a little extra babbling and I do a little extra things. So if you're interested in seeing things like that, or you'd like to support this channel, my Patreon channel link is down below in the description. Go out and head over and see what it's all about. I have some introductory videos and stuff like that, and there are some things on the page for you to see. Thank you so much for supporting me and having confidence in the fact that I'm going to show you some fun videos. I'll see you next week. Bye!